Here we have a Contax T2. It is set to automatic exposure mode, which is set through the green f2.8 on the aperture dial on the lens. If we turn it onto the flash icons here, the single icon is normal flash mode and the double icon is red eye reduction flash mode, when the flash operates twice, once to close down the iris of the subject's eye and again to expose the picture. These are the only two modes that you can operate the flash in. The flash won't fire unless you're in one of these two modes. This is now looking into the back of the camera, and there are a couple of things that I want to point out. One is the half a dozen little gold contacts in the film chamber. Those are the DX film reader contacts and are used to read the film speed from the film cartridge. And the other thing is immediately in front of the film frame exposure area here. You notice there is nothing immediately there. There is no shut curtain. This tells us that we have got a leaf shutter because the shutter is mounted forward in the lens. This is important because it means we won't have flash sync shutter speed issues and can sync with the flash right up to the maximum shutter speed. Here we have two rolls of 35mm film. The one on the left is Ilford HP5 Plus and it is DX coded. The one on the right is Rollei Nightbird and it is not DX coded. The silver and white area here is the DX coding along with the little barcode at the side. You see that it is on that film and it is not on that film. This is a problem for the Contax T2 because it relies on the DX coding to set its film speed. It is a good idea to use film that is DX coded in this camera because the camera will always assume a value of ISO 100 for film speed when it does not see a DX code. If the film you have loaded is not ISO 100, the camera gets the exposures wrong. You can rely on Ilford, Kodak and Fuji to produce DX coded film. It is smaller makes like Rollei and Lomo that tend not to put DX coding on their film. The Contax T2 uses a Flashmatic exposure method, which is quite an old method, but it uses it in a fully automated way, so it's difficult to see what is going on with it. So what I've decided to do is show you how the Flashmatic modes work using a much older camera, so I can set everything manually and explain everything as I'm going along, so that you can see how the relationship between focusing distance and aperture works, and how the flash guide number is applied. What I've got here is an old camera setup which strangely enough works in a very similar way to the Contax T2 Flash system. It is an old Yashica TLR. Yashica originally did a deal with Carl Zeiss to bring back the Contax brand, which eventually led to the Contax T2, so it seems quite appropriate to use a Yashica TLR. It has a leaf shutter like the Contax T2, and it has a flash sync to an electronic flash. The point about this setup is like the Contax T2, it can sync at any shutter speed with the flash, and we've got a fixed focal length lens with a single angle of coverage from the flash, which also fires at a fixed power. And so it's quite useful to demonstrate the behaviour of the Contax T2 flash system. The guide number on this flash is 22 at ISO 100, and this is used for working out the aperture based on the focusing distance to the subject. I'm now going to demonstrate the Flashmatic system used on the Contax T2 step by step and explain it as I go along. The flash I am using here has a guide number of 22 in meters, and what a guide number does is it lets you work out which aperture to set based on the focusing distance to the subject. In the little scale you can see in the middle of the flash, you can see distances in meters and below it the appropriate aperture. So at 2 meters you would set an aperture of f11, which corresponds with a guide number of 22. 2 times 11 equals 22. At 6 meters, it is recommending an aperture of f4, which is the closest aperture it can get to 22 divided by 6, which is 3 point something. Now the guide number of a flash is dependent on the film speed, so if you increase the film speed, the guide number goes up. This is reading for an ISO of 100. If you increase the ISO up to 400, and we read off the 2 meter value again, it comes in at f22, which is a guide number of 2 times 22 equals 44, which is exactly double what it was before. So the guide number is dependent on the ISO rating of the film. The way that the Flashmatic system works is that it reads the film speed from the DX code and calculates the guide number for the ISO of the film, and it simply works out the aperture to use by dividing the distance the camera is focused at into the guide number to give it the aperture value to set, and that basically is how it does its flash metering. The corresponding guide numbers for the Contax T2 Flash are 8 at ISO 100 and 16 at ISO 400. Now, using the example of a guide number of 22 at 100 ISO, I'm going to set the camera up and take a flash picture. First thing to do is set the focusing distance. This is the focusing wheel. When the appropriate distance number is at the top, it is set to the right distance. I'm going to set this to 2 meters. This will be done by focusing on the subject on the Contax T2, either using autofocus or manual focus. The next thing to do is set the aperture and shutter speed on the camera. This is done using these dials on the front. The guide number of 22 at ISO 100. At 2 meters we want an aperture of f11, which is here on the aperture dial. This moves the shutter speed down, and we have a range of shutter speeds that we can use. This being a leaf shutter, we can go all the way up to 1/500th of a second, and we can manoeuvre down to use any shutter speed that we want. But the Contax T2 does not actually go below 1/30th of a second in terms of the shutter speed it sets in flash mode. What it tries to do is it tries to use the automatic exposure shutter speed. But if you're shooting indoors in low lighting, there isn't enough light to do that, and it won't go below 1/30th of a second shutter speed. I have set the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second, and we're now ready to take a flash picture. This is all done automatically by the electronics on the Contax T2. And now I'm going to take a picture with the flash. That was 1/30th of a second at f11. Now I'm going to refocus at 4 meters and set the aperture and shutter speed on the camera. Now f22 divided by 4 gives me a value of 5.5. The closest aperture value to 5.5 is f5.6. So f5.6 is the appropriate aperture. And I'm going to increase the shutter speed to 1/500th of a second. So I've set f5.6 as the correct aperture for the distance. I'm going to up to the maximum allowable shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. I'm now going to refocus to 4 meters. And now to take a shot focused at 4 meters. Aperture f5.6, shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, which is the maximum you can use on the Contax T2. The T2 functions as a fill-in flash when there is enough lighting, in that it will set a shutter speed according to what the ambient light shutter speed is set to for the camera in automatic exposure mode. One implication of the way the flash system works is that if you want to control the aperture that you're using at a given distance, the only mechanism that you have to do this is changing the film speed. Because you can lower the film speed so long as the guide number for the film speed remains high enough for the guide number divided by the distance to be at least f2.8. Lower film speeds that still meet this condition will use a wider aperture at that distance, which gives you some indirect control over depth of field in your images. The opposite is true for higher film speeds. This is something to bear in mind if you want to go for a particular depth of field at a distance. You might have to pick a film of the right speed. If you can work out the guide number for the film speed, you can work out the aperture that will be used. Okay, so all it means now is to take a picture with the flash. And the dual flash.